had a special session on global humanitarian operation today at the SLD. It was actually really interesting because we had a combination of speakers from the civilian side together with a combination of speakers from the more defense. We had two generals and we had the Ministry of Defense. So I think it was really interesting to me. What particularly interesting to me is the fact that we obviously the title was humanitarian operations, but actually talking to the expert in the field, we actually ended up covering three different things, which are obviously the short-term humanitarian assistance, after a war or in a situation of human needs, and in this case, those are kind of short-term intervention. Then we look at the disaster relief, which obviously is something that is connected to conflict as well, but many times it's more connected to climate change, which is a big problem for especially small states which are vulnerable to climate change. And in fact, we had the Interior Minister of Fiji, who was actually a prime example in that sense. And then we had the third part, which is also what do you do for peacekeeping, long-term peacekeeping stabilization mission. And that actually seemed to be the big issue, because in a way, what we are seeing nowadays is that we have a context in which we have lots of, actually increasing demand for humanitarian assistance and for stabilization, because we have actually an accelerating climate crisis ongoing. And also we have more and more conflict. In fact, according to our Armed Conflict Survey report of the IISS, this year has actually recorded the highest number of conflict across the world. So basically you're in a situation whereby you do have a lot of demands, but also you have very, very limited resources, because of course we have, especially if we look at Europe, and we had the Swedish Minister of Defense, most of the attention is on the Ukraine crisis. So I guess the main takeaway for me is really how do we make sure that we have enough resources to actually cater for this more long-term stabilization mission. We also discussed a very interesting element, which is what do you do when you don't have a counterpart on the ground. So in a way, we look at what do you do with non-state armed groups, because many times you have maybe a non-state armed group which is actually controlling territory, and it also has legitimacy. Or whenever in situation in which you don't really have a counterpart, so maybe you have a combination of non-state armed group, maybe you have a state which is not actually legitimate, like in the case of many conflict we are seeing nowadays, in the case of Myanmar, for instance, or if we go outside the region of Haiti. So it was quite interesting hearing the different experiences, for instance, from the Philippines and from Australia, or two generals, and how do they dealing with this situation, and especially. I think it was quite interesting what some of them said, which is about trying to always intervene. The military shouldn't intervene as a standalone, right? It should be always within the framework of a civilian-led operation, and also within the framework of, if possible, multilateral regional response. So I think we really highlighted a lot of different challenges going forward. And the other challenge is really what do you do with the long-term trends of accelerating climate change, and what do you do to actually alleviate the issue that climate change is going to impose to fragile states that many times, as we know for our work on conflict, are actually the ones that are most subject to conflict, and are also the ones that are more vulnerable to climate change. So I think fundamentally the big question we left open was like, how do we actually ensure that there are more resources for adaptation in many of those countries, but also obviously climate mitigation, which is something that of course vulnerable countries can do, but is actually more responsibility of the global north. So I think that was, for me, the main takeaway in terms of this is the long-term trends that we need to address somehow.